The clock on the wall showed 10 minutes past 9, and Rachel was counting down the minutes until her shift ended. Her feet ached from running back and forth across the dining room all evening, but she kept her smile in place. Working at Riverside Garden, one of the fanciest restaurants in town, meant dealing with all kinds of people. Some were kind, some were demanding, and some were just plain difficult. Rachel had been working there for almost 2 years now. The pay wasn't amazing, but the tips were usually decent, and more importantly, the schedule worked around her classes at the music school. Every penny she earned went toward her tuition, her tiny apartment, and the endless pile of music books she needed for her studies. She was so close to finishing her degree in piano performance, just 1 more year to go. The restaurant was winding down for the night. Most tables were empty now, with just a few late diners finishing their desserts. Rachel was wiping down the counter near the kitchen when the front door swung open. In walked a man who immediately commanded attention, and not in a good way. He was probably in his mid-50s, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than Rachel made in 3 months. His watch gleamed under the restaurant lights, the kind of watch that screamed money. He had that air about him, the kind of person who was used to getting exactly what he wanted, exactly when he wanted it. 3 other men in similar suits followed behind him, laughing at something he'd just said. Rachel's manager, David, greeted them warmly and showed them to a table in her section. Great. She had been hoping to finish her closing duties and get home to practice for tomorrow's lesson. But work was work, and she needed every shift she could get. She grabbed 4 menus and walked over to their table with her best professional smile. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Riverside Garden. Can I start you off with something to drink? The man in the expensive suit didn't even look up at her. He was scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging her presence. One of his companions ordered a bottle of wine, specifying a particular vintage that Rachel knew was one of the most expensive on the menu. I'll get that right away for you, she said, turning to head to the wine cellar. Wait, the main guy said, finally looking up from his phone. His eyes swept over her with barely concealed dismissal. Do you even know which wine he's talking about, or do we need to explain it to you? Rachel felt her cheeks warm, but she kept her composure. Yes, sir, I'm familiar with that selection. It's an excellent choice. He smirked. If you say so. Try not to bring us the wrong bottle. I'd hate to have to send you back to get what we actually ordered. His friends chuckled uncomfortably. Rachel nodded and walked away, her jaw tight. She'd dealt with rude customers before, but something about this guy's tone really got under her skin. He wasn't just being demanding, he was being deliberately mean. When she returned with the wine, she poured a small amount for him to taste, as was customary. He took a sip, swirled it around dramatically, and shrugged. It's acceptable. Barely. Rachel knew for a fact that wine was outstanding. The restaurant's sommelier had personally recommended it dozens of times, but she wasn't about to argue with a customer. I'm glad it's to your liking. Are you ready to order, or would you like a few more minutes? We'll order now, he said, snapping his menu shut. But let me guess. You're going to try to push whatever the kitchen is trying to get rid of tonight, right? That's what servers do. Sell us the stuff that's about to go bad. Rachel took a slow breath. Actually, sir, I was just going to tell you about tonight's special if you're interested. The chef prepared a beautiful sea bass with sea bass, he interrupted, rolling his eyes. How original. Let me tell you something, sweetheart. I eat at the finest restaurants in this city. I've had meals prepared by actual celebrity chefs. So forgive me if I don't take dining recommendations from someone who probably thinks the height of cuisine is whatever's on sale at the grocery store. The table went quiet. Even his business associates looked uncomfortable now, shifting in their seats and suddenly finding their napkins very interesting. Other diners at nearby tables had stopped their conversations, glancing over with raised eyebrows. Rachel felt her face burning, but she refused to let him see how much his words stung. "Of course, sir. Take your time deciding. I'll be back in a few minutes." She walked back toward the kitchen, her hands shaking slightly. David caught her eye and came over immediately. "You okay? That guy being a problem?" "Nothing I can't handle," Rachel said, though her voice wavered just a bit. "Just another person who thinks treating service workers badly makes him look important." David frowned. "You know, that's Richard Chen. He owns half the commercial real estate downtown. Develops those luxury apartment buildings that none of us could ever afford to live in. He's been here before. Always acts like he owns the place." "Well, he doesn't own me," Rachel muttered, straightening her shoulders. She wasn't going to let this guy ruin her night. She had too much riding on this job to let one person's bad attitude get to her. For the next hour, Richard found every possible opportunity to make her feel small. When she brought out their appetizers, he complained they were too cold, even though she'd brought them straight from the kitchen. When she refilled his water glass, he made a comment about how she'd probably never seen a table setting this nice before. When she checked if they needed anything else, he asked if she'd finished high school, then laughed as if he'd made the world's funniest joke. Through it all, Rachel maintained her professionalism. She smiled when appropriate, apologized even when she'd done nothing wrong, and did her job exactly as she'd been trained to do. But inside, she felt humiliated. She thought about all the hours she'd spent practicing piano, all the sacrifices she'd made to pursue her dream. She thought about her scholarship audition next month, the one that could change everything for her. She thought about her professor's words. "You have real talent, Rachel. Don't let anyone make you forget that." But right now, serving this arrogant man who saw her as nothing more than an insignificant servant, it was hard to remember her worth. Finally, the meal ended. Rachel brought over the check, placing it politely on the table. Richard pulled out a platinum credit card without even glancing at the total and handed it to her. When she returned with the receipt, he scribbled a signature and stood up, his associates following suit. Rachel picked up the receipt folder after they left, and her heart sank. The bill had been over $300. Richard had left exactly $5 as a tip, but that wasn't even the worst part. On the signature line, he'd written a note. "Maybe find a career you're actually qualified for. Clearly, this isn't it." Rachel stared at the words, feeling tears prick at her eyes. She quickly folded the receipt and shoved it in her apron pocket before anyone could see. David appeared at her shoulder, having watched the whole thing from across the room. "That guy is the worst," he said quietly. "Don't let him get to you." But it was too late. Rachel excused herself and slipped into the back hallway, leaning against the cool wall and taking deep breaths. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't give Richard Chen that satisfaction, even if he wasn't there to see it. What she didn't know was that the restaurant owner, Mrs. Patricia Williams, had also witnessed the entire exchange from her office, which overlooked the dining room. And Patricia had just received some very interesting news that was about to change everything. Rachel woke up the next morning with a headache. She'd stayed up too late replaying the previous night's humiliation in her mind, and then she'd overslept. Now she was running late for her shift, which started at 11. She threw on her work clothes, grabbed a granola bar, and rushed out the door. The morning sunlight felt too bright, too cheerful for how she was feeling. Part of her wanted to call in sick, to avoid going back to that restaurant and risking another encounter with someone like Richard Chen. But she couldn't afford to miss a shift. Her rent was due in a week, and she still needed to buy new sheet music for her upcoming recital. When she arrived at Riverside Garden, David was at the host stand going over the reservation book. He looked up and gave her a sympathetic smile. "Hey, how are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Rachel said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "Just another day, right?" "Actually," David said, lowering his voice, "Mrs. Williams wants to see you in her office before you start your shift." Rachel's stomach dropped. Patricia Williams, the owner of Riverside Garden, rarely called staff into her office unless something was wrong. Had Richard complained about her? Was she about to get fired for somehow offending their wealthiest customer? "Did she say what it's about?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David shook his head. "She just said to send you up as soon as you got here. But don't worry, you didn't do anything wrong. Trust me." Rachel made her way up the stairs to the second floor where the administrative offices were located. She'd only been up here a handful of times in 2 years. Her hand trembled slightly as she knocked on Mrs. Williams's door. "Come in," came the warm voice from inside. Patricia Williams was in her early 60s, an elegant woman who'd built Riverside Garden from nothing 30 years ago. She'd started as a line cook and worked her way up to owning one of the most respected restaurants in the city. Everyone who worked there had heard the story of how she'd saved every penny, taken every risk, and never given up on her dream. "Rachel, please, sit down," Mrs. Williams said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Her expression was kind, which helped ease some of Rachel's anxiety. Rachel sat, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for whatever was coming. "First, I want you to know that I saw what happened last night with Mr. Chen," Mrs. Williams began. "I watched the entire thing from up here. The way he treated you was completely unacceptable, and I'm sorry you had to endure that." Rachel felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of relief. "Thank you. I tried my best to stay professional." "You did more than that. You showed remarkable grace under pressure. That's exactly the kind of person I want representing my restaurant." Mrs. Williams leaned forward. "But that's not why I called you here. David mentioned to me a while back that you're studying piano at the conservatory. Is that right?" Rachel nodded, surprised by the change in topic. "Yes, ma'am. I'm in my final year. I'm working toward my performance degree." "How long have you been playing?" "Since I was 7. My grandmother taught me on her old upright piano. When she passed away, she left me that piano, and I've been playing ever since. It's the only thing I've ever really wanted to do with my life." Mrs. Williams smiled. "I thought so. There's something about the way you carry yourself. Artists have a certain quality about them, even when they're doing other work to pay the bills." She paused. "I have a proposition for you, and I want you to really think about it before you answer." Rachel's curiosity was fully awakened now. She sat up straighter in her chair. "Every year," Mrs. Williams continued, "we host a charity gala here at the restaurant. It's a big event. We raise money for the Youth Music Foundation, an organization that provides instruments and lessons to kids who couldn't otherwise afford them. We bring in about 200 guests, some of the most influential people in the city. Local business owners, philanthropists, community leaders, that sort of crowd." Rachel nodded, vaguely remembering seeing preparations for such an event last year. "We always hire a professional pianist to perform during dinner. It's a highlight of the evening. Well, our pianist just canceled on us this morning. Family emergency, has to fly out of state. The gala is next Saturday, 1 week from today." Mrs. Williams looked directly into Rachel's eyes. "I'd like you to be our pianist." For a moment, Rachel couldn't speak. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Finally, she managed, "Me? But I'm still a student. I've never performed at anything that formal before." "David says you're incredibly talented. He heard you practicing in the back room once during your break. He said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard." Rachel remembered that day. She'd thought everyone had left for the evening, and she'd sat down at the old piano the restaurant kept in the storage room, just letting her fingers wander across the keys. She'd had no idea anyone was listening. "Mrs. Williams, I'm honored, really I am, but that's a huge responsibility. What if I mess up? What if I'm not good enough for that kind of audience?" "Rachel," Mrs. Williams said gently, "I've been in the hospitality business for over 30 years. I've learned to read people pretty well. I see something special in you. Not just talent, but heart. That's what makes a performance truly memorable." She paused. "Besides, I should mention that Richard Chen is one of our biggest donors. He's already bought an entire table for the gala." Rachel felt her breath catch. Richard Chen would be there. The man who'd humiliated her, who'd left that cruel note, who'd made her feel worthless. He'd be sitting in the audience while she performed. Mrs. Williams seemed to read her thoughts. "I'm not asking you to do this for revenge, Rachel. That's not what this is about. I'm asking because I genuinely believe you're the right person for this job. But I won't lie to you, there's a certain poetic justice to the situation, isn't there?" Rachel's mind was racing. A week to prepare. A performance in front of 200 people. The chance to play at a real event, not just a student recital. This was the kind of opportunity she'd dreamed about, the kind that could open doors for her career. But it was also terrifying. What if she froze up? What if her hands shook so badly she couldn't play? What if she proved Richard Chen right, that she really wasn't good enough? "Can I have a day to think about it?" Rachel asked. "Of course. But I do need to know by tomorrow so I can make other arrangements if necessary." Mrs. Williams stood up and walked around her desk, placing a gentle hand on Rachel's shoulder. "Whatever you decide, you'll still have your job here. This doesn't affect that at all. I just thought you might want the opportunity." Rachel thanked her and left the office in a daze. She went through her shift on autopilot, her mind 1,000 miles away. During her break, she found herself drawn to the storage room where that old piano sat covered in dust. She sat down and lifted the fallboard, revealing the yellowed keys. Her fingers found their familiar position, and she began to play. It was a piece by Chopin, one she'd been working on for months. Her professor said it was too advanced for her, that she should wait another year, but Rachel had fallen in love with it the first time she'd heard it, and she couldn't resist the challenge. As she played, the stress of the past day began to melt away. This was where she belonged, at a piano, with music flowing through her fingers. This was who she really was, not just a waitress serving demanding customers. She was an artist, a musician, someone with a gift to share. When she finished, she sat in silence for a moment, her hands resting on the keys. And then she knew. She knew what her answer would be. The next morning, Rachel walked into Mrs. Williams's office with her shoulders back and her head held high. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll play at your gala." Mrs. Williams beamed. "Wonderful. I knew you'd say yes. Now let's talk about what you'll need to prepare." As Rachel left the office an hour later with a contract in her hand and a list of pieces to prepare, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt hope. And maybe, just maybe, she felt ready to show Richard Chen and everyone else exactly who she really was. Rachel had exactly 7 days to prepare for the most important performance of her life. 7 days to turn herself from a music student into a professional pianist worthy of playing for 200 of the city's most influential people. 7 days to prove that she was more than just a waitress taking orders. The first thing she did was call her piano professor, Mr. Harrison. He'd been teaching at the conservatory for 20 years and had trained dozens of successful performers. When Rachel explained the situation, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "A week?" he finally said. "Rachel, that's not much time." "I know, but I have to do this, Mr. Harrison. I need to do this." He must have heard something in her voice, some determination he'd never heard before, because he sighed and said, "All right. Come to the studio tonight at 7. Bring your best pieces and we'll figure out what you're going to play." That evening, Rachel sat at the beautiful grand piano in Mr. Harrison's studio, her hands hovering over the keys. She'd brought sheet music for 5 different pieces, each one she'd been working on throughout the semester. "Let's hear the Chopin," Mr. Harrison said, settling into his chair with a cup of tea. Rachel took a deep breath and began. It was the same ballad she'd been practicing in the restaurant storage room, the one he'd told her was too difficult. Her fingers moved across the keys, and she poured everything into it. Every frustration, every dream, every moment of doubt and hope. When she finished, Mr. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked over to the piano. "That was remarkable, Rachel. I mean it. I've heard you play this before, but tonight there's something different. There's fire in it now." "So I can perform it at the gala?" "You can," he nodded, "but you'll need a second piece. Something that shows a different side of your playing. The Chopin is passionate and technically demanding. You need something that shows your sensitivity, your ability to make the piano sing." They spent the next hour going through options. Finally, they settled on a piece by Debussy, something flowing and beautiful like water and moonlight. It was less showy than the Chopin, but just as challenging in its own way. It required absolute control and a delicate touch. "Now," Mr. Harrison said, "here's what you're going to do. You're going to practice both pieces every single day, but not for hours on end. Your muscles need rest. 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening. Quality over quantity. And I want you to visualize the performance. See yourself walking out to that piano, sitting down, playing perfectly. The mind is just as important as the fingers." Rachel left the studio that night with a practice schedule and a renewed sense of purpose. But she also felt the weight of what was ahead. This wasn't just another student recital where the audience was mostly other students and supportive parents. This was the real world, and she'd be judged by people who knew nothing about her except what they heard in those few minutes. The next few days blurred together in a haze of work and practice. Rachel would wake up at 6 in the morning and practice for 2 hours before her shift at the restaurant. Then she'd work lunch and dinner service, her mind half on taking orders and half on running through passages of music. After her shift ended, she'd go home and practice for another 2 hours before collapsing into bed. Her roommate Beth watched this routine with growing concern. On the third day, she knocked on Rachel's door while Rachel was in the middle of a particularly difficult section. "You need to eat something," Beth said, holding out a sandwich. "You've been playing for an hour and a half straight, and I heard your stomach growling from the living room." Rachel's fingers paused on the keys. She hadn't even realized how hungry she was. "Thanks," she said, accepting the sandwich gratefully. "I just need to get this right. This one section keeps tripping me up." Beth sat down on the bed. "Can I ask you something? Why are you pushing yourself so hard? I mean, I know this performance is important, but you're running yourself into the ground." Rachel took a bite of the sandwich and thought about how to explain it. "You remember that guy I told you about? The one who was so horrible to me at work? The rich jerk who left you that nasty note? Yeah, I remember. I still think you should have thrown a drink in his face." Rachel smiled despite herself. "He's going to be at this gala. He's going to be sitting right there in the audience." "Oh," Beth said, understanding dawning on her face. "So this is about proving him wrong." "No," Rachel said slowly, surprising herself with the realization. "At first I thought it was. But the more I practiced, the more I realized this isn't about him at all. This is about me. This is about proving to myself that I belong up there, that I'm good enough, that all these years of sacrifice and struggle have been worth it." Beth squeezed her shoulder. "You are good enough. You've always been good enough, but I get it. Sometimes we need to prove it to ourselves." The day before the gala, Rachel had her final practice session with Mr. Harrison. She played through both pieces without stopping, and when she finished, her hands were shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. Mr. Harrison nodded slowly. "Technically, you're ready. The notes are there. The interpretation is solid. But Rachel, I need you to understand something important." She looked up at him, waiting. "Tomorrow night, you're not going to be perfect. No one ever is. You might hit a wrong note. You might have a memory slip. Something unexpected might happen. And that's okay. What matters is how you recover, how you keep going. The mark of a true performer isn't playing perfectly, it's playing truthfully, even when things don't go according to plan. That's not exactly reassuring, Rachel admitted. He laughed. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to prepare you. The audience doesn't expect perfection. They expect authenticity. They want to feel something. And you, Rachel, you have that gift. You make people feel the music. So tomorrow, don't think about that man who was cruel to you. Don't think about impressing anyone. Just sit down at that piano and share your gift. That's all you need to do. That night, Rachel barely slept. She kept running through the pieces in her mind, her fingers twitching slightly as if playing on invisible keys. Every time she started to drift off, she'd jolt awake, suddenly convinced she'd forgotten how the next section went. Finally, at around 3 in the morning, she got up and made herself some tea. She sat by the window, looking out at the quiet street below, and thought about her grandmother. The woman who'd first placed her small hands on piano keys when she was just a little girl. The woman who'd always believed she could do something special with her life. I wish you could be there tomorrow, Grandma, Rachel whispered into the darkness. I wish you could see what your piano lessons turned into. But in a way, she knew her grandmother would be there. Every time Rachel played, she felt her grandmother's presence, guiding her hands, encouraging her to be brave. The next morning arrived too quickly. Rachel woke up with her alarm and immediately felt her stomach tie itself into knots. This was it. Tonight was the gala. Tonight she would step out of her role as a waitress and step into her true identity as a musician. She spent the morning practicing lightly, just enough to keep her fingers warm without wearing herself out. Then she forced herself to eat lunch, even though her appetite had completely disappeared. Beth helped her choose what to wear, a simple black dress that was elegant without being flashy. At 4 o'clock, Rachel arrived at Riverside Garden. The transformation was stunning. The main dining room had been completely rearranged. Tables were set with white linens and crystal glasses. Flowers were everywhere. And in the center of it all, on a small raised platform, sat a gorgeous concert grand piano. Rachel approached it slowly, almost reverently. She sat down and played a few scales, getting a feel for the instrument. It was beautiful, perfectly tuned, with a rich, warm tone that filled the room. Mrs. Williams appeared beside her. How are you feeling? Terrified, Rachel admitted, but also ready, I think. You're going to be wonderful, and Rachel, thank you for saying yes to this. Whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Rachel felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't cry now. She needed to save every ounce of emotion for the performance. Guests would start arriving in 2 hours. 2 hours until Rachel would face Richard Chen again. 2 hours until she would show everyone who she really was. The guests began arriving at 6:30, and Rachel watched from behind the curtain that separated the small backstage area from the main dining room. She could hear the sound of laughter and conversation growing louder as more people filled the space, the clinking of champagne glasses, the rustle of expensive fabrics, the confident voices of people who were used to being in rooms like this. Rachel's hands felt like ice despite the warmth of the room. She flexed her fingers, trying to keep them loose and ready. Mr. Harrison's words kept echoing in her mind. Play truthfully. Don't aim for perfection. Just share your gift. David peeked through the curtain and gave her a thumbs up. Full house, he whispered. You've got this, Rachel. Everyone here is rooting for you. But that wasn't quite true, and they both knew it. Through the gap in the curtain, Rachel could see Richard Chen arriving with his group. He was wearing a different expensive suit tonight, this one probably costing even more than the last. He moved through the crowd like he owned the place, shaking hands, laughing loudly, making sure everyone noticed him. He had no idea that the waitress he'd humiliated would be the one performing tonight. Rachel wondered what his face would look like when he realized. Part of her wanted to see his reaction. Another part of her just wanted to focus on the music and forget he existed. Mrs. Williams appeared at her side, elegant in a navy blue gown. "It's almost time. Are you ready?" Rachel took a shaky breath. "As ready as I'll ever be, I think." "Remember, they're not here to judge you. They're here to support the Youth Music Foundation and enjoy an evening of beautiful music. You're giving them a gift tonight. That's all this is." At 7 o'clock sharp, Mrs. Williams took the small stage and welcomed everyone. She talked about the foundation, about the hundreds of children who'd received instruments and lessons because of donations from evenings like this. She shared a story about a young boy who'd discovered his love for the violin through their program and was now studying at a prestigious music school. "Music has the power to change lives," Mrs. Williams said, her voice carrying across the room. "It certainly changed mine, and tonight we have someone special performing for you. She works here at Riverside Garden, but what many of you don't know is that she's also completing her final year at the conservatory. She's a gifted pianist, and we're honored to have her share her talent with us this evening. Please welcome Rachel Torres." The room filled with polite applause. Rachel stood up, smoothed down her dress, and stepped through the curtain. The lights were bright, making it hard to see individual faces in the audience, which was probably a good thing. Her legs felt unsteady as she walked to the piano, but she kept her head up and her steps measured. She sat down on the bench and adjusted it slightly. Then she looked down at the keys, those familiar black and white patterns that had been her companions for so many years. Her hands found their position, and for just a moment everything else fell away. Then she saw him, Richard Chen, sitting at a table near the front with his business associates. The moment their eyes met, she saw recognition flash across his face. His expression changed from mild boredom to surprise, then to something that looked almost like amusement. He leaned over to the man next to him and whispered something. They both smirked. Rachel felt her confidence waver. What was she doing? She was just a music student playing at being a professional. These people were going to see right through her. Richard had been right about her all along. But then she remembered something her grandmother used to say. "Baby girl, the piano doesn't care who your parents are or how much money you have in your pocket. It only cares if you have something to say. And you, my sweet Rachel, you always have something to say." Rachel closed her eyes for a brief moment, said a silent prayer, and placed her fingers on the keys. The first notes of Chopin's ballad filled the room, soft and tentative, like a question being asked. Then the melody grew stronger, more confident. Her fingers moved across the keys with a precision that came from years of practice, but also with a passion that came from somewhere deeper. She'd played this piece 100 times in practice. She knew every note, every phrase, every dynamic marking. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't just playing notes on a page. She was telling a story, the story of every doubt she'd ever had, every sacrifice she'd made, every moment she'd wanted to give up but kept going. The music swelled and soared. The technical passages that had given her so much trouble during practice flowed effortlessly now. Her hands seemed to know exactly where to go, what to do. She'd stopped thinking about the mechanics and was simply feeling the music. Around her, the room had gone completely silent. The conversation had stopped. The clinking of glasses had ceased. Every person in that room was listening, really listening, to what she had to say through the piano. Rachel's eyes were half closed, her body swaying slightly with the music. She was no longer aware of the audience, no longer thinking about Richard Chen or his cruel words. She was somewhere else entirely, in that space where musicians go when they're truly connected to their art. The piece built to its dramatic climax, her fingers flying across the keys with power and precision. Then it softened again, becoming gentle and reflective before the final triumphant ending. When she played the last chord, she held it, letting it ring out and fade naturally into silence. For a heartbeat, the room remained completely quiet. Rachel lifted her hands from the keys, suddenly aware again of where she was, of the 200 pairs of eyes watching her. Had she messed up? Had they not liked it? Then the applause began. It started as a few claps, then built rapidly into something thunderous. People weren't just clapping politely. They were standing up, giving her a standing ovation. Some people had tears in their eyes. A woman near the front had her hand over her heart, clearly moved. Rachel stood up and bowed, feeling overwhelmed. She glanced toward Richard's table. He was standing too, but unlike everyone else who was applauding enthusiastically, his hands were moving slowly, mechanically. The smirk was gone from his face. In its place was an expression Rachel couldn't quite read. Shock, maybe, or disbelief. But she didn't have time to think about him because Mrs. Williams was gesturing for her to sit back down. She still had one more piece to play. Rachel returned to the bench, waiting for the applause to die down. Her heart was pounding, but in a good way now. The first piece had gone well, better than well, but the Debussy would be the real test. It required a completely different touch, a different mood. She began the second piece, and it was like painting with sound. Where the Chopin had been passionate and dramatic, the Debussy was like moonlight on water, shimmering and ethereal. It required absolute control, every note shaped with care, every phrase breathing naturally. This piece showed a different side of her artistry. It proved she wasn't just technically proficient, but also sensitive and nuanced. The melody floated through the room like a gentle breeze, sometimes barely audible, then swelling with emotion before retreating again. Rachel let herself get lost in it. She thought about all the beautiful things in life, the way morning light streams through a window, the sound of rain on a roof, the feeling of being truly understood by another person. She put all of that into her playing, trying to share those feelings with everyone listening. As she played, she noticed something. People had set down their forks and knives. They'd stopped pretending to eat. They were simply listening, completely absorbed in the music. This was what Mr. Harrison had meant about making people feel something. When the final notes of the Debussy faded away, there was another moment of profound silence. Then the applause erupted again, even louder than before. The entire room was on its feet. People were shouting, "Bravo!" An older gentleman in the front row had actual tears streaming down his face. Rachel stood and bowed again, feeling like she might cry herself. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. She'd walked into this room as a waitress and proved that she was so much more than that. She was an artist. She was a musician. She was someone with a gift worth sharing. As she looked out at the sea of standing, applauding people, her eyes found Richard Chen again. He was still standing, but his expression had completely changed. The arrogance was gone. The dismissiveness had vanished. In its place was something that looked almost like shame. He was clapping now, really clapping, and he couldn't seem to take his eyes off her. Rachel let herself enjoy the moment. Not because she'd proven Richard wrong, but because she'd proven herself right. Rachel stepped off the stage on trembling legs, her whole body buzzing with adrenaline. She'd barely made it through the curtain when David wrapped her in a huge hug, lifting her off her feet. "That was incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Rachel, I've never heard anything like that in my entire life. You were absolutely amazing." Before she could respond, Mrs. Williams was there too, her eyes glistening with tears. "My dear girl, you were extraordinary. Simply extraordinary. I knew you were talented, but that was something else entirely." Rachel felt like she was floating. The applause was still echoing in her ears, and she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. She'd walked out there terrified, and somehow she'd managed to not just play the notes, but to really perform, to connect with the audience in a way she'd never experienced before. "I need to sit down," she said, suddenly feeling dizzy. David guided her to a chair and someone handed her a glass of water. Her hands were still shaking as she brought it to her lips. Through the curtain, she could hear the buzz of excited conversation. People were talking about the performance, and from what she could catch, they were saying wonderful things. One voice carried above the others, an older woman saying, "I've been to concerts at the Symphony Hall that weren't half as moving as that." Mrs. Williams squeezed her shoulder. "Stay here for a moment and catch your breath, but fair warning, there are a lot of people out there who want to meet you." Rachel's heart, which had just started to slow down, picked up speed again. Meeting the guests hadn't occurred to her. She'd been so focused on the performance itself that she hadn't thought about what came after. "Do I have to?" she asked weakly. Mrs. Williams smiled. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to. But Rachel, these are people who could help your career. Connections matter in the music world. And right now, every single person in that room wants to talk to you." Rachel took a deep breath and nodded. She'd come this far. She couldn't hide backstage now. When she stepped back into the dining room, the response was immediate. People turned toward her, and suddenly she was surrounded. A man in his 70s introduced himself as the director of the city's arts council. A woman who taught at a prestigious music academy handed her a business card. Someone else mentioned a summer concert series that was looking for performers. Rachel tried to keep up with all the names and compliments, her head spinning. Everyone wanted to know where she'd trained, who her teachers were, where she was planning to perform next. It was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. Then the crowd parted slightly and she saw him. Richard Chen was making his way toward her, and the expression on his face was unlike anything she'd seen from him before. He looked uncomfortable, almost vulnerable. The swagger was completely gone. Rachel's stomach tightened. Part of her wanted to turn and walk away, to avoid this confrontation entirely. But another part of her, the part that had just performed in front of 200 people, stood her ground. Richard stopped a few feet away from her, his hands clasped in front of him. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, just looked at her with an expression that might have been regret. "Miss Torres," he finally said, his voice much quieter than it had been that night at dinner. "I wonder if I might have a word with you, in private." Rachel glanced around. Several people were watching this interaction with curiosity. She could say no. She could walk away, but she found herself nodding. "All right." They moved to a quiet corner of the room, away from the crowd. Richard seemed to be struggling with what to say, which was probably a new experience for him. A man like him was used to being confident, in control. Now he looked almost lost. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "More than an apology. What I said to you last week, the way I treated you, it was inexcusable. There's no justification for it. I was arrogant and cruel, and I'm deeply sorry." Rachel had imagined this moment during her practice sessions. She'd pictured telling him off, making him feel as small as he'd made her feel. But now that it was actually happening, she didn't feel angry. She just felt tired of carrying that hurt around. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why were you like that to me?" Richard looked down at his expensive shoes. "Honestly, because I could be. Because I've spent so long surrounding myself with people who tell me what I want to hear, who laugh at my jokes even when they're not funny, who never challenge me. I've become the worst version of myself, and I didn't even realize it until tonight." He looked back up at her, and she could see genuine shame in his eyes. "Watching you perform, seeing what you're capable of, it made me realize how wrong I was. I judged you based on your job, never considering that you might be more than what I saw. That was my failure, not yours." Rachel was quiet for a moment, processing his words. An apology was something, but it didn't erase what had happened. "Do you know what hurt the most?" she said softly. "It wasn't just the insults. It was the note you left, telling me to find a career I was qualified for. You made me doubt myself right when I needed confidence the most." Richard winced. "I know, and I can't take that back. I can't undo the damage I caused. But I want you to know that you proved me wrong in every possible way tonight. You're not just qualified to be a musician. You're gifted. You're exceptional. And I'm sorry I ever made you question that." "Thank you for saying that," Rachel said. She meant it, even though the apology didn't magically heal everything. "But you know what I realized while I was preparing for tonight? This was never really about you. It was about me learning to believe in myself. To trust my own abilities, regardless of what anyone else thinks." Richard nodded slowly. "That's a lesson I could stand to learn myself." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. "I'd like to make a donation to the Youth Music Foundation in your name. It won't make up for my behavior, but maybe it can help other young musicians who are working as hard as you have." "How much were you thinking?" Rachel asked, curious despite herself. $50,000. Rachel's eyes went wide. That was more money than she made in 2 years at the restaurant. "That's very generous." "It's the least I can do." He wrote out the check and handed it to Mrs. Williams, who had quietly appeared beside them. Then he turned back to Rachel. "I hope someday you can forgive me. But I understand if you can't." Before Rachel could respond, a young man in a suit approached with an excited expression. "Excuse me, Miss Torres? My name is Kevin Walsh. I'm a talent manager, and I'd love to talk to you about representation. What you did tonight was remarkable, and I think you have a real future as a concert pianist." Rachel's breath caught. A talent manager. This was the kind of break she'd dreamed about. "I'd be interested in hearing more," she managed to say. As Kevin launched into details about upcoming opportunities, Rachel caught Richard's eye one more time. He gave her a small nod and a genuine smile, then quietly slipped away into the crowd. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Rachel talked to more people than she could count, collected more business cards than she could hold, and heard more praise than she knew what to do with. Mr. Harrison showed up near the end of the night, beaming with pride. "I told you that you were ready," he said, pulling her into a hug. By the time the last guests left, Rachel was exhausted but exhilarated. Mrs. Williams found her sitting at the piano, gently running her fingers over the keys. "How are you feeling?" Mrs. Williams asked. "Like my whole life just changed," Rachel admitted. "Is that crazy?" "Not at all. That's what happens when we step into who we're truly meant to be." Mrs. Williams sat down beside her. "You know, you still have your job here if you want it. But I have a feeling you're going to be too busy performing to spend much time waiting tables." Rachel smiled. "I'll miss it, though. This place, these people, they supported me when I needed it most. I won't forget that." Over the next few weeks, Rachel's life transformed completely. The talent manager helped her book a series of performances at venues throughout the city. The Arts Council offered her a spot in their Emerging Artist Showcase. The Music Academy invited her to give a masterclass to their students. Offers kept coming in, each one more exciting than the last. She did keep working at Riverside Garden, though just one shift a week. It kept her grounded, reminded her where she'd come from. David joked that she was their most overqualified server, but he said it with pride. 6 months later, Rachel gave her senior recital at the conservatory. The concert hall was packed, and in the front row sat Mrs. Williams, David, Beth, Mr. Harrison, and dozens of other people who'd supported her journey. Even Richard Chen was there, sitting quietly in the back, applauding with genuine appreciation. As Rachel took her final bow that night, she thought about how far she'd come. From a waitress being humiliated by a stranger to a pianist building a career doing what she loved. But more than that, she'd learned something invaluable. Her worth had never been determined by how others treated her or what job she had to do to pay the bills. Her worth came from within, from her talent, her dedication, and her refusal to give up on her dreams. The little girl who'd learned to play on her grandmother's old piano had found her voice, and the whole world was listening.